Hi, thank you for coming out to the Cornell Political Union, everyone. I realize everyone's busy with examinations and everything, but it means a lot that you can come out, and we do have a really exciting talk today. So for those of you who haven't been to the Cornell Political Union before, it's an open forum for students to discuss pertinent topics in American politics today. And for those of you unfamiliar, the format usually goes, we allocate the first 20 to 30 minutes for the speaker, Professor Kreps, to give her presentation on the topic and her argument for what she believes. And the next 10 to 15 minutes will be devoted for questions, and the remaining time will be student discussion, basically talking why we agree or disagree with Professor Kreps' argument. So today's topic will be on drones. Drones have become an essential part of the United States military tactics these days. As modern technological warfare has increased and advanced, so has the need for drones. And a recent article in the Washington Post said that 90% of the casualties in a 5-month campaign in Afghanistan were innocent men and women who were not the intended targets of the attacks. So it really brings up the questions, are the moral implications worth using drones? And today we have a very exciting speaker. We have Professor Sarah Kreps. She's the Associate Professor in Cornell University's Department of Government, the Adjunct Professor of Law at the Cornell Law School, and the Associate Director of the Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. She has numerous publications on outlets such as the Washington Post, the International Herald Tribune, the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, USA Today, CNBC, and Reuters. Wow, that's a lot. She has also served as the Acquisitions and Foreign Area Officer in the United States Air Force, so clearly she knows what she's talking about, and I'm very much looking forward to her talk. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy time of year, so it's great to see that you could make it. One of the things I wanted to do before getting into the argument was to give a little bit of background. And I'm guessing some of you have read about drone strikes in the mainstream media, but I thought I would just start with a little bit of data. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll talk about some trends in drone strikes. Kind of my foil, which is the basis for drone strikes, why we see these being done with such frequency. And then I'll talk about my critiques, and I'll put those under a few headings. One is the issue of democratic accountability, the second is effectiveness, and the third is a question of legality, and the fourth is proliferation, which is getting at the next chapter of this topic of drone strikes, which is the U.S. has done a lot of these. What do we think going forward, and why does it matter what the U.S. does? So as you know, or as you may have seen, this has become, as you heard just now, these have become increasingly used in combat. And so I wanted to just put up some data that has been collected through 2014. And I go all the way back here because there was a lone attack in 2002 in Yemen. The first known drone strike outside in active battle space. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And so then you go a year without it, then a couple in Pakistan. And one of the things that has drawn a lot of attention is the fact that, even though we think now of the legacy of George W. Bush as being kind of the figure of bellicosity, when it comes to drones, it was relatively kind of an unused tool in the toolkit. And what you see then is an increase in 2008 and then really a huge spike in 2010 and 11. And this is by country. I want to just narrow the focus though, because this is across many countries and many years. And so what we see here, this is 2008 to 2014 where most of the action is. And I limited it to the 3 countries where there's a bunch of action. I want to just go back to this for a second and say that these cases of Libya and Iraq tend to get a lot less. Here's Iraq, and actually this should be updated because what we've been seeing now in Iraq and Syria there has been a use of drone strikes. The thing is, no one's keeping data on that, and that's one of the things that is kind of interesting, and that people who study this tend to differentiate between the strikes that are happening in these areas, Somalia, Pakistan, and Yemen, and the ones that are happening in what are called active battle spaces, like Libya and Iraq. Most people don't have a problem with these. So we know that drones are being used in Afghanistan. Most people just sort of bracket those off and focus on the critiques here, and that's kind of what I'm going to do too. We can talk about why that is. So here's again, this is the main action, and this is 2008 to 2014. Most of these strikes are in Pakistan, but you can see 2012 is a year where there were more strikes in Yemen than there were in Pakistan. But this is where we really see, this is, I think, what provoked a little bit of consternation about the Nobel Peace Prize going to the president that then ended up conducting almost 500 drone strikes. And to the point that was raised earlier, the question is about casualties. One of the questions, I should say, is about casualties. So just yesterday, so you can see, you might look at this data and say, well, gee, this is not really an issue anymore because we're not doing these strikes like everyone has learned. We either got the bad guys or the U.S. doesn't want to incur the wrath of the other countries. Just yesterday, a strike in Somalia at this training camp, just yesterday, I mean literally just yesterday, killed more people in a single set of strikes than I think on any previous strike. And so what I think is emblematic about this set of strikes in terms of the problem as a whole is that there was no domestic authorization, no international authorization, and to this point about Glenn Greenwald, for those of you who've read him, he's not an impartial person, but he says no one knows the identity of the 150 people, but most are certainly deserved it. And so there is this assertion by the government that these are militants, and every account about this strike yesterday was, and this was the Obama administration defending the strikes, that these were militants. And so what this previews, I think, is this aspect of my argument, which is coming up about democratic accountability. We have no idea who these people are. We are told that they are bad guys, and we are handing over the authority to leaders of our country to act in good faith, and we hope they are, in terms of doing due diligence on counterterrorism, but also addressing concerns about international law and domestic accountability. Because there's this argument, which is we just need to trust the government that these are people that they're saying they are. So if you hear the rhetoric of the United States government, the typical, I wouldn't say trope because that's pejorative, but is these drone strikes are simply killing the people who are trying to kill us. I gave a talk on this topic a couple of years ago in Texas, and this is parenthetical, but it reminds me of this comment. And it was a group in Dallas, and I had been in this kind of ivory tower sort of echo chamber for the 2 years or so that I'd been working on this topic. And this is exactly what one of the people in the audience said. Why are you trying to tie the hands of the government that's trying to protect the American people? These are bad people trying to kill us. It is our obligation, it's the obligation of the American government to kill those people before they kill us. This is just a couple weeks ago, the former CIA Director Michael Hayden wrote an op-ed in the New York Times entitled "To Keep Americans Safe, Embrace Drone Warfare." Now, for those of you who I think are staying up with the news, and I think this even made it into some of the whatever Daily Show successors are out there, like what is the one, John Oliver, where Hayden is the one who said that if a President Trump were to give the command that the military waterboard people, the military would object. And so this is not someone that is kind of light when it comes to adhering to international law, legal standards, and he's saying we need to embrace this. And so this is really the central argument. These keep us safe, we need to keep doing it. So I'm going to outline the argument opposed. And like I said, I think these strikes in Somalia yesterday, where we're just told that the United States, some combination of drones and manned aircraft, took out 150 individuals who were being trained at a terrorist camp in Somalia. What we know from theories of democratic accountability, for those of you who've taken international relations or political theory, Immanuel Kant talked about this idea that what makes democracies different and why their propensity to engage in conflicts is different from non-democracies is that we pay the price in blood and treasure. And what has been the case is that there are two sides of this coin. One is that there used to be conscription. Obviously, we've moved away from that. And this is just a sort of further development of that. Is that now, with drones, we have no skin in the game. So there are no body bags coming back from work, and that's all for the good, because that's another question I get. Well, why do you want to see Americans killed? It's not that I want to see Americans killed. I think what having, people, again, skin in the game does is it causes, again, theoretically, but I think in practice, is the more of those, think about the Iraq War, and as these casualties increased, you've got a lot more mobilization to end that war. No one cares about this. These things are going on a nearly daily basis. Congress doesn't care because they're not getting angry emails from their constituents. And as I'll show you here, Americans love drones. So this is like, I should put this in a graph. But the main column to focus on here is this one of support. On average, about 65% of Americans support drone strikes. And I think you can kind of see why, which is it seems like a no-cost way to kill bad guys. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is that President Obama, who's a former constitutional law scholar, you can tell he's deeply uneasy about this power that's been vested in him. And you can tell that this use of drones really exacerbates those power, the authority that he's been given. He says that the very position of drone strikes and the necessary secrecy ends up shielding the government from public scrutiny that a troop deployment invites. He's saying, and he has said to Congress, I want to repeal the authorization for the use of military force. Do not give me all this authority. And let's be honest, one of the reasons, and I thought about this today, one of the reasons why it's essential to create checks and balances is you've got to have like a veil of ignorance. I don't know if any of you have taken political theory, but this veil of ignorance which says that you should do something not knowing whether the tables will be turned in the future. So I started thinking, imagine we do get a President Trump. Wouldn't it be great if you had some checks on the use of force? Probably. Depending on where you stand on that. Or let's put it the other way. Bernie Sanders, take your pick. And so you might be happy with the terms of the deal now, but you need to think longer term. And I think this is one of the things that Obama is citing, which is that the Congress and the populace has given him this vast, vast authority. And even he is not comfortable with that. So what we see is this limited check on executive power. There's little public opposition, rare congressional oversight, and so it's like a win-win situation. So we get to kill bad guys, and no one's hurt in the process, and the cost is really low. And so the argument, though, and you've seen this from former leaders of government, is this notion that because the U.S. pays such a low cost, it lowers the threshold for using force. And so Secretary Gates, in his memoirs called Duty, he talks about the idea that drones gave him the sense that war is antiseptic, no one really gets killed. Then he took a step back, he's like, wait, people are getting killed, it's just our people. That doesn't mean no one's getting killed. And are we using force in ways and at times that we wouldn't otherwise? And it's clear from his account and from numerous accounts of senior officials that it takes away that sort of second check on, is this the right thing to do? And just to preview the later message about proliferation, again, tables turning. The U.S. has a relative monopoly on this now. Think about the countries that are getting this technology. Pakistan, Russia, India, China, probably North Korea. Do you want them emulating these same behaviors? And so I think that's, again, these things are linked, of course. But what I think we see is that it has clearly lowered the threshold for the use of force. And so President Obama has talked about having a preference for capturing over killing. And guess how many terrorists we've actually captured? What percent? 2% of the 500. We don't do this. Do you know why? Because it's not a risk-free proposition. And so what does it take to capture? Like, think of who these people are in the first place. On some level, these are not good people. I'm not saying they're high-level terrorists, and that's part of the problem. But these are not good people. And so to capture these people is a risk. And so in 98% of cases, we just kill them. And so that is part of the concern here. So you end up with the military or the government being unconstrained in both time and space. So how many years are we after 9/11? 15? Nearly 15. We still have these kinds of circumstances where 150 people are killed in a set of drone strikes without any questions, any authorization. That's a concern. So what about the question of effectiveness? And I want to just grant some ground to this first part. Are they tactically effective? So what does that actually mean? Because I'm going to say that yes, they are. So the question is, are they killing the people we are trying to kill? And that is like unequivocally the answer to that is yes. So we kill some bad people with this technology. I think the equally important question that doesn't get a lot of airtime is this question of strategic effectiveness. So what does that mean? Over the long term, are we better off? Are we creating more terrorists than we're killing, essentially? And I think there are good reasons to think that the answer to that is no. So one point is this, that there have been a lot of studies of terrorist groups, and so this fancy word, decapitation, is sort of what it sounds like. It's you just take them out. And so a lot of studies actually show that this has no impact on organizational effectiveness. And so, because the argument is that we are undermining the operational effectiveness by taking out the bad guy. And I think that's suspect. I don't think that logic holds, and there are a lot of studies that show that. And that's sort of on the are you doing damage? But the other is actually, are you doing harm? And that's sort of the other side of the ledger, but it's also important. And here I think there's also evidence to suggest that there are these martyrdom effects. And a lot of the studies of groups that have gone to Yemen, and they interview families, and they interview people who have been affected by this. And I think you're not creating terrorists out of the people that just never were going to consider it. But if you think of a society as potentially being triaged, of the really bad guys that it doesn't matter what kind of cares you give them, they're going to be bad. The really good guys that are not going to be corrupted anyway. But the people in the middle, they're like, I could hate the US or I could be okay with the US. And then think about it, drone strike comes and now your brother has just been killed by a drone strike. Which side do you think they're on? I'm pretty sure they're on the hate America side. And so I think that if you think about these drone strikes as inflaming these populations, you can see the argument for them being counterproductive strategically. Now this is international approval and disapproval of US drone strikes. And the only country where they're popular is in the US. Israel is not on here, but actually Israel is fairly sympathetic to this because they also use drone strikes. But if you think about the countries that we are concerned about in terms of harboring and maybe fielding some terrorist camps, they don't really like this. And so Egypt is not home to it, but maybe they're emblematic of what the concerns may be. Middle East country, very negative toward drone strikes. So let me turn to the questions of legality. So I talked about the accountability question, I talked about effectiveness, now I'm on to the third of legality. So there's several aspects of this legality question. This is a recourse to force. Use of vellum basically means are we allowed to be using these in the first place? So what the Obama administration claims is that these are authorized under Article 51, which is a self-defense issue. And so that's what it claimed in this case yesterday, is that these are terrorists, they're in training camps, and it's all just self-defense. And my claim is that is not a very sound argument. And so there are a couple reasons for that. And one of them, and it gets back to this distinction between the places like Pakistan and the places like Afghanistan. Everyone agrees that Afghanistan, you're in a war. But these are the other cases that I think are a little dubious. If you think about what international law is trying to do, it's trying to create some rules of the game. You know, you're either at war or you're not at war, and it's a pretty restrictive. The UN Charter is a pretty restrictive document. You can't just go to war whenever you want, and that's kind of the problem here. Is that there's no authorization. There's been no authorization, and the administration is very opaque about how it knows. I mean, to that Glenn Greenwald comment, let's just trust us. These are bad people. So we don't know, and I think this has at the least needs to have more transparency to convince us that it is in fact these people are about to carry out a terrorist attack. This is another aspect of international legality, which is the conduct in conflict, and this is one that you hear a lot about. Sort of, how are we treating civilians? Are these distinguishing between civilians and combatants? And so we get the assertion that it's not just that these are principles recited at meetings, but like, great, we have this great technology, of course we're good at this. We have no collateral damage. Well, you know what the problem is? You can say there's no collateral damage if you consider every person in a combat zone to be a combatant. So basically what has happened is we take this vast, sort of broad, very liberal definition of combatant, and so you can calculate that you are killing no civilians because you consider everyone to be a combatant. I think that's one of the problems here. So both that there's evidence to suggest that we consider everyone who's a military-age male in a sort of region of combat to be a combatant. That's playing fast and loose with international law. This policy of signature strikes. Basically, you look at patterns of behavior, and one thing I'll say about drones is that these operators follow week after week after week these same behaviors, and they see this person, and he's going to them, he's meeting them with the elder, and then he goes back home, and then he goes to the elder. But no one actually knows who this person is. They just know that these patterns of behavior look pretty sinister. That's also not acceptable under international law. And this data point that was cited earlier. There's some evidence that only 2% of these targets have been high-level militants. I think that's really questionable. So what about the other aspect of legality? And this comes back to some of these accountability issues. What's the domestic authorization for the use of force? And I would say again that if, as an American citizen or someone who lives in the United States, you want to see some checks and balances. I do not want to see my commander-in-chief go to war whenever the heck he wants to. There should be some semblance of someone has given authorization. The problem with this is that the authorization for the use of military force is now 15 years old. It was passed on September 18th or 20th, and it says that the president has the authority to go after any terrorist who was or a terrorist affiliate responsible for 9/11. Okay, so right away that's a problem. That's 15 years old. But here's the problem too. We are now at targeting people who were not even organizations on 9/11. And so the administration has come up with this thing called the splinter theory. And basically it's well, there was Al-Qaeda, and then Al-Qaeda franchised out to all these other groups, AQAP and Al-Shabaab, and now where does ISIS fit? And so the administration has said that ISIS fits under this AUMF. That's just really, I think a very tenuous argument to make that authorization for 9/11, for Al-Qaeda, for these 9/11 attacks, now includes ISIS, which wasn't even around, and there's no additional authorization. So I think that's also problematic. The thing I want to turn to last is this question of drone proliferation. Because again, I think that's the next chapter in this story. So thus far, the U.S. has overwhelmingly been the country that uses drones in combat. Now we've seen Pakistan now and Nigeria have also used drones. They're using Chinese drones actually, which is a whole other story. But the question is, how should we think about the U.S. behavior in this context of the world, going forward? And so in 2005, 41 countries had drones. By 2011, 76 did. Now, again, most of these have tactical drones, that do surveillance of borders and things like that. But a number of countries are getting or have combat drones. And so the question, I think, is how should we think about U.S. behavior as we look at other countries. And here again, a number of high-level officials have come out and said, we need to be really careful with drone strikes because other countries are looking at us to guide their behavior. It's called international customary law. And it's like, okay, there's one set of law that's written down, but then there's this customary law that is state practice. Okay, what does state practice look like? U.S. state practice, fairly opaque, fairly not indiscriminate, but they've done this hundreds of times. And so the question is, is that something that we want these other countries to be doing too? And so coming back to this original argument, if you have no skin in the game, if it's lowering the threshold for using force, if you're now multiplying this over a number of other countries, what does that world look like? I think it's a pretty unsafe world, especially when you put that in a region like the United States and the Middle East. So I think I will stop there. I hope I didn't go over my time, and I'll just put this nice picture of my new released book for your viewing pleasure. So I'll take questions first, and then some discussion, or what did we say?
Questions.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Has the Obama administration elaborated at all as to the strategic value of attacking Somalia? Like, I know it happened very recently, but I mean, pretty logically, one might say if this was a non-highly militant group in a portion of Africa, like what was their likelihood that they were going to be attacking the U.S. in any immediate time frame? And then if that's not the case, then how can you argue for self-defense?
It's a great question, and so since this just happened yesterday, we don't have the full report, although if past is prologue, I don't expect to get a whole lot more information. And I think that's one of the concerns, which is we're told that this was a training camp. These people had just graduated from terrorist training school, TTS, or whatever. And it's a military, I'm sure they have acronyms too. And so we want to get those people before they now plan and carry out an attack. And so I'm not doubting that those are bad people, or they're not bad people, but people intending to do some bad things. My concern is what are the longer term consequences both for the U.S. strategically, but also kind of moving forward, that now signals to Russia. Like, you know what, you think there's some bad people, there's a training camp for like a military school in Georgia, and you think that they're maybe eyeing you for their next step in the future, you can just take them out. Like, I think that's a bad precedent to set. And I think that's worrisome. And there doesn't seem to be any sense in which the administration has to proffer, more information than it has, that these are just bad people, they deserve to die.
The fact of the matter is today that, technology, especially in the military, is advancing so rapidly, like almost as rapidly as Apple's producing iPhones. It's crazy. It's inevitable that drones are here to stay. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anywhere in the near future is the United States just going to stop using drones altogether. If that is the case, is there any scenario where drone strikes would be acceptable, both legally, morally?
It's a great question. And, one of the ways that I've thought about this is, is there precedent for carrying out an unlimited war? Like a war where, there were no constraints. Whether where we were or sort of temporally. And people have cited communism, the fight against communism. And now we're in this, epic fight against terrorism. So, and it's cliche to say this now, but you can't fight a tactic. You can't fight a war against a tactic, which terrorism is like a tactic. And so my concern is, in this sense, not so much with the fact that we're using drones. It's that, what sort of rules do we want for the world? And what is the basis for, and part of it too is imagine some other country is doing that. Again, the Russia case. Is that a world that we want? Is for Russia to just now go and take out 150 people at a military or police station? And so I think the question in some ways is a bigger existential one. Is we have this situation of individuals that do, on some level, want to do some harm. And so how do we respond to that? And people have different kind of philosophical questions about this. But one of the interesting ones about drone strikes too is, and this is why Obama has been responsible for so many of these, is that obviously the people on the, Republicans who've in the last several decades been more hawkish, relative to Democrats, they don't see any problems with this. And so there's no constituency other than Rand Paul, and that didn't really get him very far. And Bernie Sanders doesn't talk about foreign policy. But there's no constituency for restraint. And I think it comes back to this everyone's a winner thing. It's like, well, it's happening over there. And let's keep it over there, right? So let's keep the terrorist attacks over there. But I think, there are the worries, which is, think of, and I guess this is maybe a slippery slope argument. Think of scenarios where, again, you have a Donald Trump in office. And think of him, think what you will, but his temperament is a little bit impetuous. And so where do you want that going? And so you want to set sort of some rules of the road wherein, like, it almost doesn't matter who's in the White House or which country it is, that everyone's kind of following the same rules. And I think there should at least be more congressional oversight. I mean, even Obama has said this. Like, I don't want to be the one person deciding. And others have said, like, you have a system of justice where the jury is not, like, also the executioner. You have, like, a defendant, and a prosecutor. There's a system in place. And this is a case where, you have essentially one person who is deciding who's guilty and doing the executing. And so I think there probably is a scenario where it might be justified. I think that we need more of a legal framework in place to actually figure out what it is. I mean, it's totally ad hoc. We have no idea what the decision rule was that led to that outcome yesterday. And that, I think, is part of the problem, is that lack of clarity, lack of transparency.
Yeah, so I guess you talked a bit about how this is all based off of the 9/11 attacks and the original authorization of use of military force. But as we've seen, and you talked about in the splintering effect, the sort of structure and the primary targets of these drone strikes has changed, just sort of how they exist so fundamentally. I guess Al-Qaeda existing in one form as hiding in different locations, and ISIS now existing in a more bureaucratic sense and existing within an actual city with more civilian casualties and stuff. And I'm sort of curious how you would see drones being used effectively, sort of when you were talking about casualties or things like that. How has the format for terrorists and organizations that we've been targeting changed the use of, or the utility of drones?
So I want to come back. I want you to kind of bring me back if I stray too far. But for now, I want to come back to this, this here. So Al-Shabaab was not a group that was around on 9/11, and they're primarily in Somalia. So you can see there an AQAP, so these sort of splintering franchises in Yemen. And so one of the things that I think is interesting about this phenomenon is that to borrow from political science, a terminology of counterfactual. So what would the world have looked like had we not had drone strikes? And so we know we've engaged in all of these. But what we also know is that back in 2009 and 10, when military officials were asked about the terrorist problem, whether it was AQAP or Al-Shabaab, I know in Yemen, and they said it was a couple hundred. And by 2012 and 13, it was 7,000. And so figuring out causality is really hard here. But so did the terrorists arise in response to the strikes, or did the strikes follow the terrorists? But I think what we can see is that the strikes do not seem to be helping the problem. I don't think that's exactly what you were asking.
I was more curious, I guess, sort of the different terrorist organizations function in different ways and sort of exist in, like you have forgetting the word, but like the groups that'll like hide in a desert in like a very remote area, and organizations that'll exist in a city where you have families like working, like living right alongside like a leader of some terrorist group. And sort of, I know that I talked in a previous government class about sort of how like drone strikes, which were originally used for these organizations that were hiding in the desert, would not have the entire issue of casualties or like a loss there. And as you see like ISIS working in a more bureaucratic sense, or like working with a structure that exists around civilians, drone strikes become a little bit more difficult, and you get the ethical questions with it. And I'm just sort of curious if you see any like pushback on this, or people, I mean, besides the fact that we just label all people ages 18 to, or whatever, like the adult is.
ISIS is an interesting case because there seems to be a little bit of a scorched earth approach to U.S. coalition strikes back toward ISIS, and we have very little data on kind of what those strikes are, civilian casualties. It's all anecdotal at this point. Whereas one of the advantages of this is that there were groups like the New American Foundation or the Bureau of Investigative Journalism that were so fastidious in collecting this data. So we knew we could like fact check the government and say like, you said it was this person, and we know, we Amnesty went and interviewed that family member, and even that is like hard to ascertain, right? Because so the definition of a combatant is technically someone who is, you can be targeted for such time as you are directly involved in hostilities. And no one can really agree what direct involvement is. And so, you can imagine a situation where Amnesty goes to some desert place in Yemen, and they do some interviews, and they talk to the brother who's like, or I should say mom, right? It's like, no, it's my son, of course he's not a terrorist. And like Amnesty, okay, civilian, right? It's really hard to know. But I know that targeted killings, and I don't want to conflate the two, most targeted killings now where you're going after a specific sort of militant are through drones. So, but they really affected how these individuals behave. And one of the arguments in favor of targeted killings was that, especially in places like Pakistan, where these drones are going overhead all the time, basically you're keeping these terrorists in a garrison. Like, they cannot come out, they can't go to birthday parties, they can't do anything. And because they're hearing this thing, and it's like a deterrent. And as long as they're underground, unable to like tweet where they are, tweet anything, or communicate, or call their daughter for her birthday, they're ineffective. And so it affects kind of their inner workings in that sense because of deterring certain behaviors. It reminded me a little bit of, and this, I don't know if you guys followed this, the El Chapo thing. And it was actually, there was some interesting parallels with counterterrorism, because this guy, eventually is like, the siren song of this beautiful reporter, like, she might have also been like a soap opera star. And Sean Penn, this like famous, American movie star who wants to make a movie based on him, and he comes out from hiding, and that's like exactly when he gets. And so this is of course the problem, or the issue with terrorists, is that eventually they want to come out and like go to a daughter's birthday party, and that's this, but with these drones flying overhead, it really, I think in that sense, kind of interferes with their organizational structures. I have to say that I'm not a terrorist organization expert, but from the drone standpoint, I think that probably makes some sense.
Do you think we go about making change or diminishing the amount of drone strikes that we have?
I'm sorry, what?
I think we'd go about like making change.
Reducing them?
Yeah.
So, I think that there's, depending on what side of the debate you're on, I guess you can see this as some evidence that they have diminished. They've at least diminished. And again, the question is, do they diminish because we got the bad guys, or because there was a sense that maybe we needed to kind of be a little bit more restrained? And so I think that's probably a fair criticism, is that the administration has become more sort of circumspect in terms of how it's using drones. And so it gave a big speech in 2013 saying, we are going to be more accountable and more transparent. I don't think they did much, if anything, on the transparency side. But, the numbers are certainly down. Although, I guess this is number of strikes, and I'm curious how the Somalia one will count, how many strikes it will be. Because these aren't total people. Because there have been about 5,000 people killed in these strikes. And so these numbers are going down, and I guess that's probably a positive thing. Because we still haven't seen, knock wood, like terrorist strikes on our soil. So these declines do not seem to have come at the expense of U.S. security.
How do strikes in zones that are considered to be openly combative, so with Afghanistan, with Iraq, how does drone strikes in those areas get recorded at all? How do you keep that accountable? Or is there any way to?
No. So the way the Pentagon essentially says, today, we, through a combination of the B-1 and the A-10 and the Reaper, we conducted strikes against this facility. And it's all very amorphous. And so, the UK has been better at filing these Freedom of Information Acts, that have gotten data on British Reaper strikes in Afghanistan. But they were off the grid for about 3 years. So there was no evidence for 3 years. And now I just saw, as of January last year, they're collecting data on it again. And so it gives some sense of what's happening there. But it's definitely a blind spot, right? So there was all this data being collected on these, and no one really knew what was going on in these other countries. Now, again, I think that's a different kind of legal issue, but there are ethical issues as well as to I was asked today by is anyone Canadian? The CBC, Canadian Broadcast something channel corporation, about these ethical issues. Do you think the local population in these countries is getting PTSD because of just the sound and the strikes and the things like that? And there's evidence to suggest that that those kinds of issues are present. I think the bigger ones have been, are they able to differentiate between the civilians and the combatants? And I actually think that drone strikes in that regard, this is one of the positive things I would say about drone strikes, is that if a country is going to use force, it's not a bad way to do it, because these things, they loiter for hours and hours at a time. They're watching people in and out, whereas an F-16, it goes in, it does a strike and gets out. And so I think it's hard to study this empirically, but most studies will show that the real civilian casualty rates are actually lower for a drone strike than they are an F-16 strike. I mean, keep in mind that strike in Afghanistan of the Doctors Without Borders hospital was not a drone strike. And that's 30 people, and the counter-argument or counterfactual is had that been a drone strike, would they have ID'd it better? But, I mean, one of the things I've said is that it's still hugely contingent on having good intelligence. And so this case last year, the Obama came out in April of last year. I was driving to a conference at Yale, and I'm in the car, and I get this call from a reporter, and he says, "What do you think?" And I'm like, "Of what?" I'm in this in the middle of nowhere, Connecticut, and I had no idea what was going on. But Obama had just had this big press conference saying that this drone strike in January that same year had killed the American aid worker and the Italian aid worker. And they watched this site for weeks at a time. And it just so happened that the American and Italian had been in there prior to when these people in Nevada who are watching this had started paying attention. And so even if they're more precise, they're only as good as the intelligence that they're given.
Should we
Do you guys want to chat? Yeah.
Should we move on to discussion.
Yeah.
I have one question.
Okay, yeah.
Is there any reason that drone strikes, or why would drone strikes be worse than F-16 strikes? Just, you know.
No, I'm actually saying I think they're better.
Okay.
So if you have to go to war, this is a decent way to do it.
So
My contention is that I think it's causing conflict at times and in places where you wouldn't see it otherwise.
how so?
Because, F-16, you have to think about it twice. You have to think like, is this guy gonna get shot down? That's gonna be hugely bad if like the guy is, over Somalia and some rocket propelled grenade is taking him out, which is possible, it's very possible. And so, there's a great case, an interesting illustrative case of Somalia 2.5 years ago. And so first there's this compound and they were trying to get some allegedly bad dude. And they sent in the special forces. And the special forces came under enemy fire. And they came back and they just, pulled shocks and got out. And then they go back with the drone. And they get that guy and they get a few others. And so in some ways I think what it illustrates is with a drone now, they're going in, they don't have to risk, the blood and treasure because they're sending in a drone. And so, again, when you read these and talk to these officials, they will tell you that having skin in the game is what gives them pause, and there's no skin in the game here. So they just kind of are more inclined to take risks that they wouldn't take with think about, a Navy SEAL. Think of the bad press that would happen, if this Navy SEAL is on his way to capture someone in Somalia. You guys don't, but maybe you heard of the book or movie Black Hawk Down. This was huge, 1993. It was hugely negative. Mogadishu, and these Marines are being trotted through the streets of Mogadishu. It's terrible. And so, and so that makes decision makers think, do we want to use the special forces to do this? Or should, and that would make them more cautious in how they're using force. That was my point. But I think if you're going to use force, if you decide that force is what is absolutely necessary, I think it's one of the least bad options.
Thank you. Would you mind sticking around while we discuss, or if you're busy?
I've got 10 minutes, so yeah.
Yeah. So does anyone want to start off why they agree or disagree with Professor Kreps' argument?
I think the most compelling argument I've heard in favor of really just replacing all warfare with drone warfare is imagine a world where we did that, and that's the norm, and whenever we have wars, we send in drones. Moreover, we don't have a lot of wars because, I guess developed countries already don't have wars with nuclear weapons, but a similar effect. And then imagine someone proposing, well, what if instead of sending in drones, we stop using drones and start using people, and obviously that would be, not seriously, I guess. But I guess I'm confused, because you say, drone warfare is, if you're going to do warfare, drone warfare is the right way to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess I'm confused about what you are proposing.
Thanks for the clarification question. So, I'll say what I'm not proposing is a limitless war, an ability to just target anyone, anytime for the foreseeable future without any constraints. So I think more domestic oversight, and You know, and again, coming back to this question of trends, like, you know, maybe this is evidence that we have seen more constraints because we see fewer of these strikes. But just sort of an eye to having more transparency about the decision making that both constrain decision makers for the like event that you have President Trump. I keep trashing him as I don't mean to do that, but sort of the impetuous president who's like, yeah, just send it over to like, you know, Germany because there are a lot of immigrants there and some of them are potential terrorists. That's the scenario you want to avoid, and I don't think we have the institutional oversight in place to prevent that from happening.
But that could not happen with, you know, yes, and there that F-16.
So I think there are a couple of reasons why it would be less likely with an F-16. I mean, again, I think the frequency with which, like, there have been so few of this kind of counter-terrorist strike with F-16s. We do not go into Pakistan with an F-16. The question is why. And one of the kind of arguments is that there's this plausible deniability. Like, everyone knows they're American, you know, aircraft, but there's this sense of like, well, they're unmanned, there's not an American pilot. And imagine, again, a scenario where, like, this American gets shot down over Pakistan, or this tribal region. I mean, he'll have, like, his eye sockets gouged. Like, it'd be terrible. And so, you know, so you don't think twice about it. You're like, well, I'll do 450 of these. And so it's the frequency issue so I think that's what it is like, we are not at war with Pakistan. And yet, 450 times, we've carried out strikes against that country. So the issue of, like, constraining domestically so that our, you know, sort of a who's guarding the guardians situation domestically, but also the demonstration effect this has for other countries. You know, do you want to set an example where now Putin has this technology and he can say that, well, the United States has done this 500 times around the world. Why can't we go from the Caucasus to, you know, North Korea to wherever else? Does that, so, yeah. That it, you know, an involvement in places and at times where we wouldn't be. But yeah, in Afghanistan, Iraq, where we've gotten some kind of authorization to be there, to me that's a different story. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sorry for muddying the waters.
No.
Veronica?
Yeah, I also agree in the sense of, like, there is no oversight, and so you very much allow the executive branch and the administration to create a narrative, if they so choose, about there being some sort of at-risk terrorist group. So I think because there is absolutely no check on that, like, based on, like, post 9/11 fears of terrorism that have given almost complete unilateral power to these executives, that has to be stopped, because even if it's not Trump, it could be someone 15, 20 years down the line who has absolutely no sense, like, it's legally binding. Like, they have absolute unilateral power. They can make whatever military choice that they want in the name of Social Security, in the name of terrorism. That's terrifying, because that's how countries disintegrate from stronghold democracies into military dictatorships. Like, so, yeah, I agree.
Any responses? Did you?
I had a separate question.
Oh, okay. Why don't we go ahead?
Okay. So I was wondering how involved the other governments are with the drone strikes. So, like in Pakistan, where we're not at war, do they have any authorization, or like in Somalia with the strike that we just did? Do you know how involved the governments are in maybe like agreeing with the decision, or?
Is that a question for me or the group?
I guess whoever.
Could you repeat the question one more time?
Just like how much the other governments, not necessarily like maybe in Afghanistan, but like in Somalia and Pakistan, where we're not necessarily at war, how involved those governments are in maybe knowing that we're going to do the strike, or agreeing with it, or like any influence at all?
I mean, I'm sure they don't agree with being bombed in their own country, but I think that raises a big question. We call this a war, but a war is bilateral, but clearly it's very one-sided right now. And I wonder if, like Veronica, to your point, I wonder if what you're saying, it's we need a guardian for the guardian. We need some sort of check because it can be dangerous. Could you make that same argument for the armed forces? So I'm wondering if you're just making an anti-drone point or an anti-just violence altogether point.
You know, a bit of both. I find drones problematic in that even in an ideal situation, let's say every country was now to transfer over in 50 years to drone warfare, then at what point is there any kind of cost to any country if you're just shooting down other unmanned, like, motorized things? So like at one point, if everyone has a drone, then you're going to start targeting civilians, because it doesn't matter if I shoot down his drone. Like, now you need to target something that is going to incur cost to an enemy combatant. At least that's probably where my line of thinking is. But kind of more to her question, I think that it is possible that these countries are complicit, at least at some level, in allowing for the U.S. to take out these terrorist groups. But the issue is that we have no way of knowing. So like they could be, but like as a civilian, as someone not involved with the administration, like I have no authority to ask those questions, and like that kind of information could never be released.
So like, I guess like, with the situation, so the United States is just, I guess, like, how is it possible that the United States is bringing in drones without other governments? Like, how are other governments allowing that, or can they just not?
Yeah, you can.
So, yeah, I think this is fascinating because the Pakistani government, you know, there's so much political theater around them saying, like, these are terrible, I can't believe the US government is doing these, but it's like inconceivable that there's not some, to Veronica's point, complicity in this. Like, it's inconceivable that this many drone strikes were taking place in Pakistan without their tacit approval, at least. Now, Somalia has no functioning government, so that's an issue. And in Yemen, it's been, you know, generally there's been a government that is more sympathetic to the United States. But even that is just very opaque. You know, how it is that the U.S. will not say what authorization has been given. It's all kind of hearsay, circumstantial evidence. Like, well, the fact that these are happening with such frequency, ergo, like, this must have some sort of tacit approval. But meanwhile, the Pakistani government is making a big pay from, like, the vitriol towards these U.S. drone strikes. So it's an awkward diplomatic situation.
I think we have the numbers are in. The caucus is closing. I know.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, we have 8 agree, 1 disagree, no, 8 agree and 2 abstain.
Okay, so it looks like the Cornell Political Union has voted in favor of Professor Kreps' proposal. Meeting adjourned.